2 million people. 40 years, no farms, no markets, no supply chains. It begs a pretty huge question, right? How do they eat? How does a population that big survive for a whole generation in the middle of a desert? Well, the answer, it's a diet that's really unlike anything else we have in recorded history.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll look at the sheer scale of the challenge they were up against. Then we'll get into the food and water that kept them going. And finally, we'll talk about the legacy of this whole 40-year journey.
Okay, so first things first, we have to wrap our heads around the scale of this thing, because we're not just talking about a small group of wanderers here. We're talking about an entire nation on the move for 40 years.
So the text tells us there were 600,000 men of fighting age. Now, when you add in women and children, you get an estimated population of about 2 million people. Think about that. That's like the entire city of Houston, just wandering through the desert.
And the place they were wandering through, it was absolutely hostile. The Sinai Peninsula is described as a great and terrible wilderness. We're talking extreme heat, no water, dangerous animals. Honestly, surviving there for 40 years seems, on the face of it, just impossible.
So, how did they do it? What was the solution? Well, the foundation of their entire diet was this daily provision that just appeared, seemingly out of thin air.
They called it manna. And when they first found it, it was this small, round thing that appeared with the morning dew. It looked like a fine, flaky-like substance covering the ground, almost like frost.
And this is where it gets really interesting, especially from a food science perspective. The description is incredibly specific. It was white, looked like a coriander seed, and tasted sweet, kind of like a wafer made with honey. That's a very precise, almost clinical description of a food. And this stuff came with a strict set of instructions. You had to gather it every morning because it would literally melt when the sun got hot. You couldn't save it up either. Any leftovers would just spoil by the next day. The only exception was for the Sabbath. If you gathered a double portion the day before, that would stay fresh.
And this shows us that manna wasn't just something they ate raw off the ground. It was a real staple food. They would grind it up, beat it in a mortar, and even bake it into cakes. So it was this versatile carbohydrate, the foundation of their meals. But that's the key, right? It was mostly carbs. It was an energy source for sure, but nutritionally, it wasn't a complete food.
And that's where the problem starts, because a diet of just one thing, no matter how miraculous it is eventually going to take a toll. The people just got tired of it. The monotony set in, and they started to really crave the food they remembered from Egypt.
And you can really feel the exhaustion in what they say. Our soul is dried away. Imagine, after years of the same exact taste and texture, they felt like there was nothing else. This wasn't just being bored with their food. This was a deep, profound food weariness. It was their bodies literally signaling a need for something more.
And look at what they were craving. It was so specific, and nutritionally, it makes perfect sense. They wanted fish, omega-3s. They wanted cucumbers and melons for hydration and potassium. They wanted leeks, onions, and garlic, which are packed with all sorts of vital compounds. Their bodies were crying out for different micronutrients, fats, and textures that the manna just didn't have.
So what happened next was, well, it was dramatic. The text says a wind came and brought in these massive flocks of quail from the sea, and they literally just fell in and around the entire camp.
And the sheer quantity was unbelievable. They gathered quail for 2 straight days and a night. The person who gathered the least amount still ended up with something called 10 homers, which is just an immense volume. This was a sudden, massive injection of lean, complete protein, full of B vitamins and iron. It delivered exactly the nutrients that were missing from the manna.
Okay, so food is one thing, but in a desert, that's only half the battle, right? The other huge life or death issue was water, and how they got it was, well, just as unusual.
The records talk about a few different water crises. There was one spot, Mara, where the water was bitter and undrinkable, until a certain tree was used to make it sweet. Then later on, in 2 different places where there was no water at all, it came gushing out of a rock.
So, after 40 years of this, what's the final verdict? What are the long-term effects of living on just manna, quail, and water from a rock?
The summary at the end of the journey is pretty incredible. Yeah, they were fed, but the text makes a point of saying that over those 40 years, their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out, and get this, their feet didn't swell, which is something you'd totally expect on a long journey like that.
And that's the really crucial thing to grasp here. For 4 decades, They were sustained completely outside of any normal system of farming or food production. No bread made from grain, no wine from grapes. Everything they needed to live came from a totally different source.
And to make sure this story was never forgotten, they were told to save some of it. A pot of manna was supposed to be kept as a physical piece of evidence for future generations. A real food, preserved as a kind of historical and theological proof.
So why? Why this strange diet? The text itself says there was a point to it all. It was meant to teach a lesson that real sustenance, real life, is about more than just physical food. And what's wild is that this exact verse is quoted centuries later by Jesus during his own 40-day fast in the wilderness, tying right back to this original event.
And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The manna appeared for exactly 40 years. It ended the very day after they finally crossed into the new land and were able to eat the local produce. It was like the supply chain was switched off the moment it wasn't needed anymore.
So, when you boil it all down, the wilderness diet had 3 parts: a carbohydrate from the sky, a protein from the sea, and water from a rock. Sounds simple, but it was enough to sustain an entire nation.
And this whole story really makes you think, doesn't it? When an entire nation is fed for a generation, completely without farms or supply chains, it really forces you to ask, what is the true definition of food?